It began with a hammer strike, one dull blow against a wall that hadn't breathed in decades. When the panel broke, dust poured out like smoke from a long-dead fire. Inside that hollow space was a single object, a faded red backpack, its plastic cracked, the stitching worn, but still legible. Property of Benjamin Kessler, Harrow Creek Elementary. The man who found it didn't know what name he'd just spoken aloud. But for the people of Harrow Creek, that name carried 37 years of silence. Tell me where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. When I think back to 1987, I can still feel the cold in the air, how the wind cut across the cornfields and carried the smell of diesel from the school buses as they rumbled out before sunrise. Harrow Creek wasn't a busy town. We had a single stoplight, 2 diners, and a population small enough that folks waved whether they knew you or not. My father, Sheriff Alan Hartman, was the kind of man who believed every problem could be solved with patience and coffee. I was 10 that winter, a kid who sat in the back pew during Sunday school passing paper notes with a boy named Riley Spear. Back then, everything felt permanent. The same faces in the grocery line, the same plow lines carved into frozen soil, the same school bus routes that wound through the hills each morning without fail. Bus number 37 was part of that rhythm. It was an older Ford model, sun-faded yellow, with a squeaky rear door, and a driver named Earl Brenner who'd been on the job longer than most of our teachers had been alive. Every kid knew Earl's voice before dawn when he hollered, "Mornin' folks, watch your step." The first stop was always at the edge of Miller's farm, just past the oak grove where the road bent into a narrow climb. The sound of that bus coming down the hill was like a clock striking the start of every day. Folks timed their coffee, their tractor engines, even their morning news by that sound. Benjamin Kessler lived near the center of town, a quiet boy with big glasses and an old red backpack that he never took off even during recess. His mother Miriam worked at the post office sorting letters by hand in the days before scanners. She kept a photo of him taped to her sorting desk, missing front tooth, wide grin hair sticking up no matter how she combed it. People would tease her gently, saying, "That boy looks just like his daddy," and she'd smile through it, though her husband had died in a car wreck 2 winters earlier. Harrow Creek was the kind of place where grief didn't make you special. It just made you part of the fold. We all carried something. My mother worked night shifts at the diner. My father carried the weight of every unsolved case, and Miriam carried her son's red backpack each afternoon to the front porch, waiting for the bus that always came on time. January of '87 was bitter. The thermometer never rose above 20, and ice lined the fence posts like glass. On those mornings, you could see the children's breath rising in the air as they waited at their stops. Bright scarves, metal lunch boxes, chatter muffled by mittens. Earl's headlights would appear through the fog like a promise that school would start, and the day would be normal. That winter, the town looked almost beautiful in its stillness. The creeks were frozen to mirrors, and the church bell on Main Street echoed across the valley each hour. In a place like that, routine wasn't just comfort, it was survival. But memory is strange. Looking back now, I can see the cracks starting to form even before anyone realized it. The small things that didn't seem like much at the time, a teacher noting that the bus had left the yard a few minutes early one morning. A farmer saying he saw it take the long road past the barns instead of the highway. Miriam mentioning that Benjamin had started complaining about Thursdays, saying they made his stomach hurt. I remember the last Sunday I saw him. He was sitting 2 rows ahead of me at church, fidgeting with a pencil stub, drawing something on the back of a hymn sheet. I couldn't see what it was, only that he kept erasing it, redrawing it, tracing in tight little circles until the paper nearly tore. When service ended, he left the pencil behind. I picked it up. It had teeth marks all along the edge. My father always said you could feel a storm coming before it hit if you paid attention to the quiet. The week before it happened, that quiet changed. The wind stopped for a full day. Dogs barked at nothing. Even the school intercom cut out for a few seconds mid-announcement, just static. It sounds superstitious now, but in a small town, silence can be louder than anything. I didn't know then what my father was working on in his office. Those night's files spread across the dining table, a half-empty mug of black coffee gone cold by midnight. He was tracking transportation logs, something about fuel discrepancies. But when I asked, he only said paperwork. He'd tap his pencil twice on the edge of the folder, close it, and tell me to head to bed. That Sunday evening, a light snow began to fall over Harrow Creek. Street lamps turned the flakes gold, and every porch glowed faintly through the mist. Miriam Kessler called my father around 8 p.m. to ask if he'd heard anything strange on the scanner. Lately, she said Benjamin had been quiet all weekend, drawn into his sketchbook, wouldn't say what he was working on. My father told her not to worry. "He's a creative kid," he said. "That's a good thing." Later, I'd learned that what Benjamin was drawing that weekend wasn't just doodles. He'd sketched a bus on a dirt road, a red-roofed house, and a tall stick figure with no eyes. He'd written one word next to it in crayon, "him." The next morning, January 12th, the temperature hovered around 19 degrees. The roads were clear, no fog, no ice, just another Monday in a quiet town that trusted its routines too much. My father kissed my mother on the forehead, poured coffee into a thermos, and stepped out into the frozen dawn. He paused on the porch, listening to the distant hum of bus engines rolling out from the district lot. Down the road, Miriam turned on her porch light the same way she always did when Benjamin was getting ready for school. She stood there with his lunchbox in her hands, watching for the yellow blur to appear through the trees. It should have been just another morning, but the bus never slowed at her driveway. By sunrise, the town was awake and the cold had settled deep into the valley. Coffee steamed in diner windows, tractors groaned to life, and yet one porch light stayed burning long after the sun rose. I remember passing by on my way to school, the glow from Miriam Kessler's house still cutting through the pale gray mist. She was still standing there, coat over her nightgown, the lunchbox clutched to her chest. The bus should have come by 15 minutes earlier, but the road ahead was empty, and the sound of its engine never came. It was the kind of morning where the frost never quite melted off the mailboxes, and the air carried that thin metallic chill that bites the lungs. By the time I arrived at the sheriff's office, the sun had already burned pale through the clouds, but the light felt wrong, sharp, too clean, like the world didn't know yet that something had gone missing. The phone on the dispatch desk was ringing off and on reports coming from different ends of town. Kids hadn't shown up to class. A bus hadn't arrived. My father was still sheriff then, standing over a road map with one hand pressed to his forehead, muttering to the deputies to check the route again. I remember his tone steady but strained, the way you sound when your gut already knows something's gone sideways, but your mind won't let you admit it. By 8:30, it wasn't a matter of delay. The radio chatter had turned from confusion to fear. A 12-seat bus had vanished off a 28-mile route in daylight on dry roads. Not a single tire mark. Not one witness who'd seen it stop, turn, or slide. It was as if the road had swallowed it whole. I was still too young to understand the scale of what was happening then, but years later, when I joined the same department, I'd find the photos my father's first search teams lined along the ditches, bright orange jackets cutting through the gray. The school had called every parent by 9, and soon the lot outside the elementary was filled with parked trucks, headlights still running, mothers gripping scarves against the wind. Miriam Kessler was among them, still holding her son's lunchbox. She stood at the curb while the principal explained that the bus never arrived. I remember that image clearer than anything, the silver thermos in her hand, the condensation on the lid. Her eyes fixed on the road as though the bus could still crest the hill and make it all make sense again. By noon, the search widened. Deputies were crawling the back roads, the Forestry Service brought out ATVs, and the county borrowed a helicopter from the next district. But there was nothing to find. No broken branches, no ditch marks, no debris. The radio tower picked up only static when they tried to hail the driver. The whole thing felt impossible. Even the weather refused to cooperate. A light snow began to fall around 2 soft flakes that erased what little chance we had of seeing tracks. My father worked through the night. He had maps spread out across the dining room table when I came downstairs for water. His coffee had gone black and cold, and his hands were shaking from exhaustion. He said one line that stuck with me. They didn't just disappear. Someone drove that bus somewhere. It was the first time I'd ever heard doubt in his voice. Over the next week, Harrow Creek changed. The usual laughter at the diner turned to whispers the school shut down for emotional recovery days, and volunteers combed the woods until their boots split. But nothing turned up. The FBI arrived after day 3, set up a command post in the gym, and interviewed everyone within 10 miles of the route. My father kept a running list of names on a legal pad, crossing off every person who'd seen something, even if it was just the glint of yellow through the trees. By the end of the week, only one witness had any clear memory: the farmer, Walter Riggs. Walter said he'd waved at the bus around 6:45, same as he did every morning when it passed his silo. He was certain it was heading west that day toward the old back loop road. But that stretch didn't lead anywhere, just a pair of weathered barns and private farmland before it circled back. My father went out there himself with a deputy. They found nothing but frost tire grooves frozen solid from earlier traffic and one old shoe print near the ditch, adult-sized, no tread pattern. It could have been anyone's, but my father circled it in red ink anyway. When the days turned into weeks, the official search shifted from rescue to recovery. But without a single scrap of evidence, there was nothing to recover. The newspapers called it the vanished bus mystery. My father hated that. These are children, he said, not a headline. He never forgave himself for not finding them. He retired in 2005, still carrying that case in his pocket, like a stone he couldn't put down. I didn't think about Bus 37 much after that, not until March of 2024, when my phone buzzed with a call from a contractor working a renovation outside town. I'd just finished a shift when the dispatcher told me a construction worker had found something odd inside an abandoned farmhouse wall. Normally, that kind of call means old newspapers, maybe a raccoon nest, but the contractor had sounded shaken, said it was a backpack, said the name stitched on it matched one from the old missing children's case. When I arrived, the house looked like it hadn't been lived in since the 90s, peeling clapboard siding porch half-rotted through wind howling through broken panes. The man who'd made the call, Eli Granger, met me at the front door, hands still coated in plaster dust. He pointed to the living room wall where he'd pulled down part of the drywall. Behind it was a sealed cavity, and inside, resting upright like someone had placed it there carefully, was a red backpack. I recognized the patch before he even said the name, property of Benjamin Kessler. The zipper was cracked, but the contents were dry, preserved by decades of insulation. Inside were a handful of Polaroid photos and a small cassette tape labeled Stop Number 13, Play Me. I remember the smell of the dust when we lifted it out. Old plaster, faint mildew, a trace of something chemical. Whoever sealed that wall had wanted the air tight. We bagged everything and sent it straight to the lab. That night I pulled the old case files from storage. They were brittle now, yellowed around the edges, the ink fading. Each folder held a school photo, 12 children frozen in time. Bright eyes, crooked smiles, collared shirts. Benjamin was the 4th one in the top row, 11 years old. The day before the disappearance, he'd turned in a drawing to his teacher, a school bus on a dirt road, sky filled with spirals. She'd pinned it to the bulletin board without a second thought. When I looked at the photo of him now, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been trying to tell us something all along. The next morning, we digitized the tape. The audio opened with static, then a boy's voice, thin, trembling, the kind of fear that sits in the throat. "If someone finds this, I hope it's someone good," he said. The bus didn't stop. We passed my house. "Stop number 13. He said we were going to the farmhouse, but I don't think this is a field trip." Then a pause, soft breathing, and the last words, "Please, don't let my mom think I ran away." When the tape cut off, the room stayed quiet for a long time. I could hear the hum of the overhead light, the faint scrape of someone's pen rolling off the table. One of the younger techs whispered, he knew he wasn't coming back. I sat there, thinking about my father, about how he'd spent the rest of his life wondering if those kids had died quick or slow. This tape told me something worse, that they'd known it was happening. We processed the Polaroids next. 12 pictures, all from inside the same bus. The first few were harmless kids laughing blurry motion, the flash catching their faces mid-conversation. But the last few shifted. The children sat still, hands folded in their laps, all staring straight ahead toward the driver's seat. Only there was no driver visible. In the final photo, a tall shadow stood in the aisle, too dark to see a face, and the angle of the camera suggested someone small had taken it from behind the last seat. The timestamp matched the morning they disappeared. That night, I went home and pulled one of my father's old notebooks from a box in the attic. It was filled with sketches of routes, roadside notes, gas receipts. On one page, he'd written, possible detour near Ryant's Farm West Loop. No public access. I cross-referenced it with modern maps. The farmhouse where we'd found the backpack sat exactly 30 miles west of the last confirmed sighting of the bus. It wasn't random. Someone had driven there. By the third day, we had enough to reopen the file. I stood in the conference room, surrounded by photos of the 12 missing kids. I pinned Benjamin's at the center. For years, I'd grown up with those faces staring out of the sheriff's bulletin board, frozen under the words, presumed deceased. Now, for the first time, there was something new. A voice, proof of motion proof they'd made it somewhere. Officer Dunn. My partner brought in the forensic results from the backpack. The prints were degraded, partial, impossible to match to any known database, but the tape was clean, protected in its casing like someone had wanted it to survive. That thought sat heavy with me all day. People hide evidence when they're afraid, but they preserve things when they want to be found. Later that evening, I drove out to the farmhouse again. The air smelled like thawing soil and diesel. The sun was setting behind the ridge, turning the fields the color of rust. Inside the living room, the cavity in the wall gaped open like a wound. I turned on my flashlight and caught a glint on the opposite wall. Faint crayon marks, barely visible. A child's drawing taped crookedly to the plaster. A school bus. A red-roofed house. 12 stick figures standing in a line. Above them, a tall figure drawn in black with no eyes. Next to it, one word written in shaky letters. Him. I took a photo and backed out of the room. My breath fogged in the cold, but I could feel sweat prickling under my collar. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a message, a breadcrumb left decades ago by a child who refused to vanish quietly. When I got back to the office, the lab had one more result waiting. The screws that sealed that wall. They weren't from the 1980s. The metal corrosion dated them closer to the early 2000s, which meant someone had reopened that wall years after the bus vanished. Someone who'd known what was inside. I drove home past midnight, the roads empty except for deer crossing through fog. The old school sat dark on the hill, its windows reflecting my headlights like open eyes. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was standing in my father's footprints, chasing the same ghost that had haunted him until the day he died. Only now the ghost had started whispering back. The next morning I returned to the farmhouse with a small team. We brought UV lights to check the walls around the drawing. Under the beam, faint handprints appeared beneath the paint, small ones layered over each other reaching upward. The technician turned to me and said quietly, "Looks like they were trying to get out." I couldn't answer. My radio crackled with static. Then Dunn's voice came through from outside. "Callie, you're going to want to see this." I stepped out onto the porch. She was kneeling by the front steps, brushing away a patch of dirt near the baseboard. There, carved shallow into the wood, was a small spiral. Next to it, a number. I remember the sound of wind pushing through the trees behind us, carrying the dry rattle of last year's leaves. It was the same sound that used to echo through the valley when Bus 37 rolled past on its way to school. Only now it sounded like something turning back around. The spiral carved into the porch wood sat no bigger than a quarter shallow but deliberate, the kind of mark made by someone who had time to think about what they were doing. I remember brushing my glove over it, feeling the rough groove under my thumb. Dunn was standing beside me, waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't. My mind was already turning back to that number 13, and how the boy's voice on the cassette had whispered it like a warning. Stop number 13. The farmhouse was never on any bus route. It wasn't a stop at all. Someone had invented it, a hidden detour on a road that wasn't supposed to exist. We called the county archives that afternoon to pull property records. The parcel was listed as 41B under an old name Ryan's Farm sold off in the late 70s after the family lost it to foreclosure. After that, it had changed hands half a dozen times. Rental tenants, LLCs, one lease in the mid-90s to a man named Harold Wright. But what stopped me cold was a handwritten note buried in the margin of an inspection file from 1987 report of screaming near barn, no action taken. Sheriff A. Hartman notified. My father's name. He'd known something about this place, maybe even come out here himself. I sat there staring at that pencil mark, wondering why he'd never mentioned it, and whether he'd tried to tell me in his own quiet way before he died. The next morning, I drove out to the Harrow Creek Historical Society. The building sat behind the old library, dusty glass cases full of photos from county fairs, yellowed newspapers taped to corkboard. The woman at the desk, Mrs. Kepler, recognized me instantly. Alan's girl, she said, her voice soft. He used to spend half his nights in here. She pointed me toward the back room where the property ledgers were stored. I spent an hour flipping through records until I found what I was looking for. The Ryan's Farm had been leased in 1986 by the Harrow Creek Transportation Office for temporary vehicle storage and maintenance overflow. The signature on the lease, Lyle Healer. I remembered the name from the old personnel roster in my father's files. He was the district's transportation supervisor back then, oversaw all the drivers, including Earl Brenner, the man who'd driven Bus 37. He'd retired in '89, died in 2004, but that paper trail was too clean. People don't sign their names to ghosts unless they think no one will ever come looking. That afternoon, I drove to the bus depot on the edge of town, the one that still smelled like diesel and wet rust. The depot manager, Cliff Neese, had been there since 1980. When I showed him a photo of the old yearbook page with the cafeteria shot, the one where a man sat at the back table wearing a spiral ring, Cliff leaned in close, squinting at the grain. "That ain't Earl," he said, "but I've seen that ring before." His voice dropped a notch. "He used to come by here sometimes, said he was maintenance, always hung around Bus 37. Brought some kid with him, once said he was his helper. I remember because they installed some radio equipment that didn't belong." He frowned. "Back then you didn't question folks with district badges. I asked if the man had a name." Cliff scratched his chin, trying to pull it from memory. "Lyle something. Wore cologne strong enough to choke a horse." He pointed toward a wall of framed employee portraits. "Second row, middle." There he was, Lyle Healer, smiling, faintly silver ring on his right hand. Back at the precinct, I ran a search through the old employment records. Healer's file was thick, most of it routine until I found a disciplinary note from 1981. Unauthorized individuals allowed on district property after hours, bus moved without dispatch approval. The complaint had been dropped the same week. The principal's signature was illegible, but my father's initials were there in blue ink. I sat with that for a long time. The pattern was starting to form, but it wasn't something I could say out loud yet. There was still too much I didn't know. That evening, I drove to Pine Tree Lane. Miriam Kessler still lived in the same red brick ranch where Benjamin had grown up. The house looked frozen in time, lace curtains, bird feeders along the porch rail, the same porch light that had burned the morning the bus never came. When she opened the door, she looked at me like she'd already been waiting. I heard she said softly, "You found something?" I nodded, careful not to promise more than I could deliver. Inside, the living room smelled of lemon polish and tea. She moved slowly, still graceful, despite the years. On the coffee table sat a small wooden box. Without a word, she opened it and handed me a crayon drawing edges curled with age. It showed a bus on a bridge, water beneath it, full of faces. In the driver's seat, a stick figure with a black ring around its hand. He drew this a few days before, she said. I thought it was just a dream. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. He used to say he didn't like Thursdays. Said his stomach hurt every Thursday morning. I'd tell him school was almost the weekend, but he'd say that's when the man with the ring drove. I thanked her and promised to keep her updated. As I left, she said something that stuck with me all the way back to the car. He wasn't scared of the bus. He was scared of where it went after. The next morning, the lab called. They'd enhanced the Polaroids from Benjamin's backpack. One photo stood out of the bus aisle, reflected in the driver's mirror. The face caught in that reflection wasn't Earl Brenner's. The man behind the wheel wore a heavy ring with a dark spiral carved into the band. I printed the image and tacked it to the board beside Healer's file. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a system, something built inside the school's own infrastructure. A man with authority over the drivers, access to the buses, and enough influence to erase a route. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the tape, Benjamin's voice saying, "Stop number 13. The way he'd said it, it wasn't confusion. It was knowledge. He knew where they were being taken. He even called it the farmhouse. By dawn, I had my coat on and a fresh set of maps spread across the table. The 1987 topographic survey showed something the modern maps didn't: a dotted easement road long overgrown, cutting through old farmland west of the last stop. It led straight to parcel 41B. Back then, it wouldn't have been paved, just a rutted trail. But it was there. A private road known only to locals and maybe to someone who'd driven that route for years. When the sun came up, Dunn met me at the gate to the trail. The barbed wire was sagging, rusted through the no trespassing sign, half buried in weeds. We walked the first 100 yards in silence, our breath showing in the cold. After 10 minutes, the path widened into a clearing circled by moss-covered stones. In the center stood the remains of a wooden platform, sunken and warped. It looked like the base of something, maybe a structure long gone. I crouched down and brushed away a layer of dirt. Beneath it, half buried, was a small rusted plaque etched with a single spiral, and under it a phrase, "The returning is the removal." I felt the hair rise on my arms. Dunn whispered, "That sounds like a motto." I didn't answer. My mind had already jumped ahead to what kind of people would use a phrase like that, and what removal meant in their language. We flagged the site and called CSU to process it. They'd bring ground radar, maybe find the bus itself buried somewhere under decades of soil. But even as we marked the coordinates, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't a burial site. It was something older, more deliberate. That afternoon, I went back through transportation records, cross-checking substitute drivers from late 1986. One name appeared briefly, Gerald Denton. Temporary fill-in for 3 weeks while Brenner was on medical leave. No photo, no address, just a payroll stub and a termination note dated January 9th, 3 days before the disappearance. I found a margin note in my father's handwriting. Denton short-term replaced Brenner. Background incomplete. It was enough to reopen a personnel trace. But before I could submit it, the CSU team called again. They'd finished digging around the farmhouse and found something in the old well behind the property, a sealed glass jar wedged into the stone. Inside was a slip of paper, brittle but legible. 12 names written in a child's hand, each one marked with a spiral except for one, Benjamin Kessler. Next to his name was a hand-drawn arrow pointing up. I drove out there myself that evening. The field was lit by flood lamps, the kind that make everything look like daylight but colder. The jar sat on a steel tray, still damp from the soil. I read that paper 3 times before I let it go. Benjamin had written those names. He'd known what was happening, and somehow he'd believed he could climb out of it. As I stood there, wind pushing through the trees, I looked up at the farmhouse silhouette against the dusk and thought of the 12 Polaroids. The last one, where the kids sat, still hands folded, staring forward at something just out of frame. I realized the driver wasn't the only one on that bus who knew what was coming. I drove home in silence, headlights cutting through fog. On the passenger seat, I kept the copy of Benjamin's list folded in plastic. 11 spirals, 1 arrow. Somewhere inside that pattern was the truth, and the boy who'd drawn it had tried to leave it behind for someone who might one day listen. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there a long time before turning off the engine. In the reflection of the windshield, the porch light behind me formed a small spiral halo on the glass. It was just the bulb's glare through mist, but for a second it looked deliberate, like a message caught between worlds. I remember whispering to no one in particular, "I hear you, Ben." The next morning I ordered a full excavation of the well, but even before the first shovel hit dirt, I knew we weren't just digging for evidence. We were digging through layers of silence that had been buried by people who thought they could control what the world remembered. That's the thing about small towns like ours. Secrets don't stay buried forever. They wait quietly, patiently for the right noise to wake them. The excavation began just after sunrise. Frost still clung to the grass behind the farmhouse, and the air carried that dull, metallic chill that always comes before a hard thaw. CSU had set up portable lights around the old well, their cables snaking across the yard like veins. I stood at the edge, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the first section of stones being pried loose. It was quiet except for the low hum of generators and the occasional scrape of metal on rock. Every sound felt amplified out there, shovels biting into dirt boots, shifting over frozen ground, breath fogging in the light. I kept thinking about Benjamin's list about the arrow next to his name, the only one pointing up. There was hope in that little mark, or defiance, maybe both. Either way, it meant he'd fought to be seen. At 20 feet down, one of the techs called up that he'd found something wedged in the wall, a paper tray brittle and waterlogged. They lifted it out, carefully wrapped in plastic. Inside was a half-rotted sandwich, a child's lunch, and a melted pink keychain shaped like a unicorn. I didn't have to check the files to know who it belonged to. Emily Shore, age 9, one of the 12. Her mother had described it in her original statement nearly 40 years ago, said Emily never went anywhere without it. Seeing it there after all this time made the whole investigation shift in my chest from mystery to mourning. These weren't just names on a caseboard. They were kids who'd laughed on a bus one cold morning and ended up here. Later that afternoon, Dunn came in from the perimeter holding her phone out. "You're not going to believe this," she said. A psychiatric intake record had surfaced from a defunct adolescent facility 2 counties over, dated 1994. A Jane Doe had been admitted female, found wandering barefoot along a rural road, mute, no ID. She had a scar on her shoulder in the shape of a spiral. I remember staring at that photo on Dunn's screen. Sunken eyes, matted hair, a blank expression that looked more like exhaustion than madness. The file had been closed when the patient turned 18 and disappeared. But the face, even in grainy black and white, was unmistakable. It was one of our 12, Whitney Dane. By nightfall, I was in a rental car headed west toward Cleveland, following an address tied to a cleaning company that had hired a woman under a different name, Maya Ree. She worked nights, no social media, no listed phone number. The apartment was in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city, small windows flickering security lights in the parking lot. When she opened the door, I saw the resemblance, immediately older, thinner, but the same blue eyes from the yearbook photo I'd been staring at for weeks. She looked at my badge like it might burn her. "You're from Harrow Creek," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Inside the apartment was bare. A mattress on the floor, a single shelf of books, nothing on the walls. She stayed standing while I explained why I was there. When I mentioned Benjamin's backpack, she flinched. I told her about the Polaroids, the tape, the list of names. She sat down slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. "You found it," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone ever would." I asked her what happened in 1987, and for a long time she said nothing. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. Then, in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear, she began. "It was supposed to be a normal day," she said. "Earl wasn't driving. There was another man, tall, thin, smelled like sawdust and cologne. He wore a ring-black swirl on silver. He smiled the whole ride. Told us we were going somewhere special, that school was canceled." Her eyes drifted toward the floor. Some of the kids were laughing, but Tasha started crying. Marcus said he wanted to get off. Then the doors locked. She paused, her voice catching. "We turned onto a road I'd never seen before. Dirt and trees, no houses. He said it was a shortcut. But we didn't stop until the farmhouse. I could hear the radiator ticking in the corner as she described what came next. The children were separated into small groups, taken to the basement, told it was part of a game. There were 2 men, sometimes 3, all wearing rings. They called each other brother and referred to a man named Father Heller. When I showed her Lyle Heller's photograph, she froze. "That's him," she said. "He was in charge. He said we were chosen to be unwoven." I asked what that meant, but she just shook her head. He said it was about truth, about removing what didn't belong. I didn't understand. Her breathing quickened as she spoke, and I told her we could stop, but she went on. "They took 2 kids first, Tyson and Isla, told us they were ready. We never saw them again. Then Harper, then Trevor. Benjamin tried to fight them once. He said the spiral was wrong, that it trapped people. He'd draw his backward, said it went up instead of down." She looked at me, then, eyes glassy but steady. "One night there was a fire. I don't know how it started. Maybe Benjamin did it. The door was unlocked for the first time in weeks. He ran. I remember hearing the footsteps. He didn't scream. He just ran." I sat there in silence, the weight of her words settling into the room. After a moment, I showed her a printed photo of the ring we'd found on Haler's hand. She flinched, whispering, "They said it was the mark of the returning." Then she told me something that made my stomach twist. "He said if we failed the spiral, we'd be removed." That's what he called it. Removed. Back at the precinct, I filed the report and went straight to evidence. The techs had started logging the artifacts from the well fragments of bone, a child's shoe, strands of hair. They'd also uncovered a trap door beneath the farmhouse furnace sealed with plywood and metal brackets. When they pried it open, the smell hit first old rot and chemicals. The stairs descended into darkness. I went down with them, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The air was thick, heavy with mildew. The walls were covered in black felt. The floor warped from moisture. And there, in the beam of light, were dolls lined along the edges, their faces melted or hand-sewn from fabric. In the center lay a decayed mattress. The walls were covered in spirals, drawn, burned, carved, dozens of them. 12 in total. In the corner stood an old cabinet rusted through. Inside were VHS tapes, each labeled by hand. Unwoven Session 1. Trevor and Isla pre-removal. Whitney compliance test. One was marked Benjamin Defiance tape. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. We brought them upstairs, sealed in evidence bags, and sent them to the lab for digitizing. That night I stayed to watch one. It began with static, then a flicker of light. A small boy sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes swollen from crying. The voice, off camera, asked, "Tell them why you refused the spiral." The boy looked down. "Because it's not real." The voice came again, patient but cold. "What is real, Benjamin?" he said. "My mom. School. Outside." the voice answered. "The outside's already been removed. You're the last. Your name will seal the pattern." Then a hand entered the frame wearing the spiral ring. "Then tomorrow you'll be removed with the others." The tape ended there. When the screen went dark, no one in the room spoke. I could see my reflection in the black monitor, pale, shaken, older somehow. Benjamin had known. He'd resisted, and he'd left us the evidence to prove it. By morning, the team had cataloged more from the 4 partial skeletons, small bones consistent with children under 13. No IDs yet, but the timeline fit. I walked outside, the air sharp and thin, and looked toward the tree line. For the first time since reopening this case, I felt like I understood what my father must have felt all those years ago. The sick mix of rage and helplessness that comes when you realize the evil you're chasing isn't buried in legend or rumor. It's just men. Ordinary men who found a way to hide their cruelty behind ritual and belief. At 11 that night, my phone rang. It was Whitney. Her voice was steady but hollow. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said. "I saw Benjamin again after he ran." I asked when. "The night before the bus came," she whispered. "They brought us all to the spiral room for the final removal." Benjamin stood up. He had a tape recorder in his hand. He told Healer he'd made his own spiral, that it couldn't be broken. She hesitated. He said, "Mine goes up." After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time replaying her words. Somewhere out there in the layers of dirt and silence, that boy had tried to leave us a path. The thought of it wouldn't let me sleep. At dawn, I was already back in the evidence archive looking for a tape my father had logged and never returned. The entry dated January 1987, labeled Field Trip Play Me. His signature was the last on the page. The box was empty. If my father had taken that tape home, it meant he'd heard something no one else did, something he couldn't let go of. And maybe that was why this case haunted him until the day he died. Standing there in the cold light of the archive, I realized that whatever was buried out at Harrow Creek wasn't finished yet. The spiral wasn't just a symbol. It was a language, and Benjamin had started rewriting it. When the last tape surfaced, it was found not in an evidence locker or some hidden archive, but inside a cardboard box buried at the back of my father's closet. My mother found it while cleaning the house before the sale, an old moving box marked taxes. Inside were receipts, a rusted badge clip, and one small VHS case wrapped in a folded grocery bag. The handwriting on the label stopped me cold. Field Trip Play Me, my father's pen. His last note before he retired. For a moment, I just stared at it, feeling like the floor had tilted beneath me. All those years he'd spent poring over maps long after everyone else had given up, this was what he couldn't let go of. I played it that night in the station the same way he must have done decades before, alone in a room lit only by the glow of a desk lamp. The tape began with static, then a burst of daylight. The camera wobbled, pointed toward the dashboard of a bus. Through the windshield, you could see a narrow dirt road lined with trees. Children's voices filled the air, laughing, shouting the ordinary chaos of a field trip. Then a man's voice, calm but cold, said, "Settle down, please. This is a special route." The camera turned just enough to catch the driver's hand resting on the wheel, a silver ring flashing in the light. He was humming something low, tuneless, almost mechanical. A few minutes later, the sound changed. The laughter faded, replaced by uneasy quiet. One small voice asked, "Are we almost there?" The driver didn't answer. The camera panned again, and for a second you could see the reflection of his face in the rearview mirror. Lyle Heller. He was younger, but unmistakable. Then the view shifted downward to the aisle between the seats. A boy's red backpack lay on the floor. The zipper was half open. Inside, the glint of a small tape recorder. Benjamin's. And that's where the footage cut out. I don't remember moving after it ended. I just sat there listening to the faint hum of the playback machine, feeling my father's absence in every inch of that empty room. He'd carried this truth alone for nearly 30 years, probably knowing no one would believe it without proof. Maybe he thought he could protect us by keeping it buried. Or maybe he just couldn't face what it meant that the same man who signed off on his bus fleet, who stood beside him in district photos, had been using those routes to feed something monstrous. By the time we reopened the case publicly, the evidence had become a storm. Federal warrants went out across 3 states. Abandoned properties, sealed rooms, storage lockers, under old aliases, all tied to Heller's network. We found Ledger's photographs a secondary basement they called Sanctum 13. In one locker, a box of spiral rings, handmade, each etched slightly different, as if assigned to members of a hierarchy. Most of the men who'd been part of it were already dead. A few were living under new names, ordinary lives that didn't look like predators at all. One was a retired librarian in Montana, another a janitor at a church outside Dayton. Each arrest felt hollow in its own way. You can put a man in cuffs, but you can't recover the years he stole. Forensics matched the remains from the well to 4 of the missing children. The others were presumed among the bones recovered beneath the spiral room. Benjamin wasn't there. Not his backpack, not his body, not even his dental traces. What we did find in a sealed crawl space beneath the farmhouse floor was a small chalk spiral turned outward, an arrow drawn beside it, and the initials BK. It was faint, but enough to tell me he'd been alive when he made it. The last child to fight back, the one who'd refused the spiral. Whitney agreed to testify in the federal trial, though it took months before she could sit through the recordings. When she did, she didn't cry. She just asked if she could speak for the others. Her voice in court was steady, even gentle. "We weren't lost," she said. "We were taken, and we were told no one would come for us. But someone did." She looked at me then, and for a second I saw the child she must have been staring out the window of a bus that never came home. The courtroom stayed silent for a long moment after she finished. Even the judge looked shaken. The verdicts came down that summer. Every surviving member of Heller's network was convicted on charges ranging from kidnapping to homicide to conspiracy. Some would die in prison, others might live long enough to face parole hearings they'd never win. Justice in the legal sense was served, but in Harrow Creek there was no celebration. There were vigils, quiet gatherings at the old school gym, a new plaque installed at the bus depot with 12 names etched in brass. The town finally exhaled after 37 years of holding its breath. Still, for those who'd waited half their lives for closure, it wasn't peace, it was survival. I carried my father's badge to that ceremony, the same one he'd worn the morning the bus vanished. I placed it beneath Benjamin's name and left it there. It felt like the only apology I could give for what time had done to all of us. That night, as the crowd thinned and the candles burned low, Miriam Kessler stood beside me holding a folded piece of paper. She pressed it into my hand and said, "He wrote this for you." It was a note from Benjamin's sketchbook dated the week before the disappearance. The handwriting was uneven but clear. If it goes in circles, follow the arrow. I kept it in my wallet for months, reading it whenever the noise of the case got too heavy to bear. After the trials ended, the FBI closed the file, labeling it resolved. But I still visit the site every year on the anniversary. The farmhouse has been torn down now, replaced by open field. Grass grows over the well and wildflowers creep through the fence line. There's nothing left to see, and yet the air still carries something, a quiet pulse under the wind, as if the earth itself remembers what it had to hide. Sometimes, when the sun hits just right, I swear I can see the faint outline of the old path leading toward the woods, the same one that bus would have taken. In the years since I've moved into a different role consulting on cold cases, training younger officers who've never known what it's like to lose a whole generation of children and have nothing to show for it but questions, I tell them that evidence isn't just data, it's the echo of someone's final attempt to be seen. I tell them about Benjamin, about the boy who left behind an arrow when everyone else was told to spiral inward. They usually listen quietly, unsure whether it's a lesson or a warning. Maybe it's both. Whitney lives near Lake Erie now. She teaches art therapy to trauma survivors. Sometimes she sends drawings, soft charcoal sketches of spirals that open outward just like Benjamin's. She never signs them, but I always know who they're from. She once told me that creating new shapes helps her sleep, that every line she draws is her way of giving the others a voice they never got to use. I keep one framed above my desk, a single line curling outward into the shape of a sunrise. She titled it, "Mine Goes Up." When I think about my father now, I realize he must have known he wouldn't live to see this ending. Maybe that's why he hid the tape, to give it a chance to outlive him. In the end, it did. He was right about one thing: truth doesn't stay buried. It waits quietly until someone stops long enough to listen. And maybe that's all any of us can really do: listen to the silences left behind and follow the arrows that point us toward them. Harrow Creek looks the same from a distance. The fields still glow gold in autumn. The church bell still rings at noon. But there's a small garden now behind the elementary school, 12 stepping stones arranged in a spiral, and at the center, an empty one for Benjamin. Every year, the kids paint the stones anew, bright colors, names written in chalk that washes away with the first rain. It isn't much, but it's something. Memory turned into motion, the circle broken just enough to let the light in. If this story stayed with you, share it, not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name fades into silence again. Because somewhere out there, a truth waits under the dust, patient as time, hoping someone will finally follow the arrow home.